Hi, hello everyone, and welcome to Disasters Deconstructed Book Group. I'm so excited. This is my favorite live streams of all. As you know, I love reading books. If it was up to me, we would have a book group every month, but I'm not allowed to
I don't
impose
think
my
we could.
rules.
I don't think we could all keep up with that.
Well, for New Year aspirations and all. But no, it's so cool. Finally, we've been really looking forward to having this book group, and we had to postpone a couple of times. And so today we are discussing, I hope we've all read it, Development Drowned and Reborn by Clyde Woods. Oh, look at us!
Wow.
Oh, fancy! I love this. Hard copies. I was sure somebody would have Kindle copy, but no, we're dedicated to this book group. And so of course it was Darren's choice. Finally, it was Darren's turn as well. So Darren, I'm going to start with you. Could you tell us why have you chosen this book?
Yes. Maybe firstly, this is completely self-serving because this is probably my favorite book in my field, even though it's really hard to kind of place this book in a field. So Development Drowned and Reborn, the Blues and Bourbon Restorations in Post-Katrina New Orleans. I think it's really special and really sort of tender how the book came together following the passing of Clyde Woods a few years ago, and Jordan T. Camp and Laura Polito put a great amount of care into kind of cranking out the completed manuscript and presenting the book. For me, it's a really important text that articulates in very real ways what it means for a disaster to not be natural. It also very clearly, for me, and we can get into it, but it sort of shows what Cedric Robinson in Black Marxism talks about in terms of racial capitalism, or the dialectic between how race and capitalism are sort of co-constitutive forces. Right? It wasn't necessarily like one or the other, that entire regions and populations of people can be pulled into forms of violence and relating that produce a landscape that engenders further violence. And also just a really good read, really dynamic with like poetry and rap and references to pop culture and references to history in ways that I just find really beautiful. So that's why I really wanted to sit with this text with all of you. And I'm really grateful that we're here.
Amazing. Thank you so much for choosing it. And yeah, well, I'm sure we all have kind of lots of thoughts and lots of questions. But we'll do the normal going around the circle, in a couple of minutes of what you thought about the book. And then I'll let you lead the discussion. Claudia, thank you again for joining us. You haven't missed any of our book groups. Then it's just so great that you're always here with us. So
I know it forces me to read. I told you I divided the amount of pages and the days that I had left to read this book up to this day. I managed to do it.
It was great. We had a great conversation with Claudia. It's like, okay, if I read 10 pages every day, then I'll be able to do this. This must help us. So over to you, Claudia. What did you think about the book?
Yeah, for me, it was a great history lesson. First of all, for those of us who are not that familiar with US history, it's such a great book in that respect. I think it's a beautiful overall historical account of how Afro-Americans were alienated from society and how this was actually orchestrated and reappropriated over the decades and even centuries, as Clyde Woods begins to talk about this book since the 17th century, if I recall well. And it actually made me think that he almost treats New Orleans like a crime scene where he digs into every piece of evidence to demonstrate how disasters were intentionally created. I pretty much got this sense from my background in forensic archaeology, where you have to prove in a court of law your expertise. And so I felt like he was this kind of expert witness for disasters. So yeah, for me, it was, I'm so glad I read it. as Darian was saying, it's actually a great book for a couple of different fields, not only you guys who are into disaster studies, but it really makes me think about my own research and how things happen locally and regionally to get to the point where they are down the line. In this case, would be Katrina. So yeah, thanks for that, Darian.
Super. Thank you so much, Claudia. Jason, first question, have you actually read the book? This is the most important question.
Ooh.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay.
There was a book group where I didn't quite finish, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's not mention that.
Yes, I read the book, and I really appreciate this choice by Darian. And I don't think it's a book that many disaster scholars really have read or get into, but it's so relevant. And I think, like a lot of disaster scholars, right, kind of cite, especially in the US, cite Katrina as something informative, like an event that kind of made them want to get into the field, or maybe it was their first experience of being in a research and kind of study or whatnot, or something just that was always on the news and kind of inspired them. But like, it's such a different take on it than you hear from the disaster scholars that have drawn on the event, right? And it kind of is tapping into a lot of the same ideas as some of the disaster literature on vulnerability, on risk creation, but it's going much deeper into the history. I think there's some kind of parallels with disaster anthropology. I think at the end, the last chapter kind of talks about the natural disaster terminology and how inappropriate that is to use with Katrina. We would argue inappropriate to use anyway, ever. But they also talk about the fact that this is a social disaster hundreds of years in the making. And then there's this really deep history, and some of it was like almost overwhelming, like the care and detail, as someone who, like, a lot of that is completely new to me, and kind of that deep engagement with culture, with politics, was pretty incredible, and really told a story about how vulnerabilities are intentionally created for political and financial ends. And I think that was kind of the key thing that stuck for me was just the like the connection between vested interests and disaster. And something that was really stuck in my mind, and I hope we can unpack, is like the role of professionals in this, especially in the built environment. And as coming from that kind of urban planning perspective, Darian, I'm interested in how your field views this kind of argument, that really is making the case that professionals are complicit in the creation of these conditions, and sometimes are just kind of trapped in this cycle where they are forced to be complicit in it. So anyway, I really appreciate it. It's such a deep read that sometimes it was like challenging to get through for me, but really rewarding.
Okay, my turn. I'll be honest with you, I found this book quite hard to read, and kind of not from literal sense, right? Not from kind of words perspective, but I sort of realized that I actually know nothing or very little about what I was reading. So I know very little about blues. my USA experience is purely theoretical, which I was like, oh, okay, I've never been to New Orleans, although I've kind of, as any disaster scholar, I probably sort of know, right, the disaster story inside out. I've never heard of the concept of bourbon restorations, for example, right? And so I found it extremely fascinating to learn about all this. But I also, as I was reading, I kept thinking, I wish I'd read the Development Arrested first, right? I wish I'd read the Development Arrested first. So perhaps that would have helped me a little bit kind of to just position my thinking. But I also felt that what this book highlighted for me is that it's really, really, really important for all of us, kind of regardless of the area, the discipline that we're working in or writing in, is that we really need to read kind of outside of our comfort zones and study areas. If, say, before this book, I haven't read, I don't know, Du Bois or Fanon or Stuart Hall or Theodore Allen, I wouldn't be able to engage with kind of 90% or maybe perhaps 99% of what's been written here, right? Because this thinking is different, but it builds on the theories that are brought by these and other scholars. And so I just found it so interesting how the story of New Orleans and the story of Katrina, but kind of the New Orleans overall, such a classic disaster case example that we all learn from the textbooks about, could be twisted so differently. And I, when Woods was talking about the idea of blues geographies, for example, or imperial bourbonism, and I've never heard about either, I started thinking, why don't we discuss this from different perspectives? Why don't we kind of apply different lenses that perhaps are unexpected, but that can really show how the freedom history of kind of freedom struggles and history of development can really be narrated in a different way. And I felt that Wood's theoretization, for me, and as I said, it was kind of difficult to engage at times, provided such a clear explanation at how global and national neoliberalism turns national. And that was perhaps the clearest, the best explanation I've ever seen. And I felt that perhaps, if Woods were alive now, he probably wouldn't be surprised by kind of COVID injustice, right, and response. He wouldn't be surprised by Trump, because that is all that disaster building on disaster, building on disaster. It's all kind of there in the book. And so to me, it was just, I enjoyed that the book offered not a historical version of Katrina that we see so often in disaster studies, but instead of kind of very historical and very political version of New Orleans and Katrina, sorry. And so it kind of showed how colonialism hasn't disappeared, right? It's far from over. It keeps going. And also what I found really interesting, and that is not really related to the book, but it's the fact that it's an edited volume, right? That it was published after Woods passed away by his colleagues and friends. And I just started digging because I was wondering how they did it. And there was a dialogue in the Antipode. I don't know if you've seen it. And apparently they were kind of editing it based on like one hard copy. Imagine, because he hadn't had any files. I was just like, oh, mind blowing. How do you do this? And such dedication to this academic work is remarkable. But it made me think, and I keep wondering about this, and I wonder what you guys think, whether you feel that they've managed to stay true to Wood's vision, and kind of to reflect and push everything that he introduced in the early chapters, and how that sort of translates in the narrative later on. So yeah, thank you for choosing this. It's something that I wouldn't have read without you. So over to you. Yeah.
Thank you for that reflection. I think I was similarly challenged by this text, and kind of similarly thinking about some of the themes that come up in relation to some of Woods' other work. He was a close colleague and collaborator with Catherine McKittrick, whose work has also been really important for me understanding the production of race, the production of landscapes and geographies, the way discipline and knowledge is sort of segmented and used. One thing that gets me about this text, even though that the subheading is the Blues and Bourbon Restorations in Post-Katrina New Orleans. The vast majority of the book grappling with events, people, ideas long before Katrina happened. I think Woods is amazing in sort of luring in a reader like me into that space. And also, I know he kind of explicitly encourages not thinking about this as a US case, not thinking about it as a Louisiana case, but sort of not taking the nation state for granted as sort of a unit, and lumping in the history of New Orleans with the rest of the Caribbean, with the experience of the African diaspora globally, and then just with like sort of global experiences with capitalist development and plunder. And I don't know, I think also it's just not something as an urban planner I'm sort of used to, sort of this messier geography that doesn't sort of fit within how I think about jurisdiction, how I think about governance. And then sort of not just focusing on sort of the death and violence and extraction, but detailing a lineage of struggle and the development of tactics of resistance, from, you know, early time of Mississippian society and talking about the way indigenous Mississippian peoples were arranged as a form of planning, how that sort of connects with the different kinds of Black people that were kidnapped and brought to that region of the world, all the way through like now, essentially. I don't know. I was challenged quite a bit by this text, and it really forced me to rethink, like you said, this sort of case study that every kind of disaster person now, at least somewhat, has to kind of engage a little bit, like Hurricane Katrina, and what it means to look at the history of Europe, the history of imperial power, the history of the Caribbean in a different way through this.
Yeah, and I think it's so difficult to counter argue most of the things he says in the book, because they are so deep. The evidence was so detailed. It just made me think, how did actually someone got to do this detailed research? It's insane. The amount of referencing, the amount of stories that are shared. You know, they say it was a work of a lifetime, and it really comes across as that. One of the things that I really liked, and Ksenia mentioned quite a bit, is that it's not only focused on what is it that leads to disasters, all the Bourbonism, the plantation block movements against the impoverished people of New Orleans, not only Afro-Americans, but poor working class, Black and white. But I also really enjoyed to learn about this blues tradition, how it played a crucial role as a movement, as a collective vision to fight this, what he calls the racial and class apartheid. I really enjoyed knowing, okay, what was out there that was really making these people move forward up until what he calls the third reconstruction, the post-Katrina. This is such an important thing. I kept going to YouTube to listen to these musicians, to read some of the lyrics. Sometimes they have been changed, the lyrics. I remember there was something that's been changed by Louis Armstrong. So I kept going to YouTube and just getting familiar with all the blues and jazz tradition that really lifted, and it wasn't some way a safe hub, a safe port for the people to voice out what they were feeling, what they were experiencing throughout the city and the region. So, yeah.
I agree with that, Claudia. The like he was speaking to mutual aid, and he was speaking to resistance movements. I was just looking back, and one of the lines that I loved was at the end of chapter 8. It says, "Not all assets are visible, and not all assets can be stripped." And it was talking about the different ideologies, you know, and that there was, although there was this overwhelming attempt to kind of crush resistance and to create dependencies and to redirect wealth upwards, despite all of that, you had this blues tradition, and you had this belief in justice and humanity that never gives up. And like, speaking to what you were saying, Darian, the way that Clyde Woods kind of drew the ideological link from the local to the region to all of humanity was pretty cool. And saying that this tradition resonates with attempts by oppressed people all around the world to resist the intentions of their oppressors, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and for the folks maybe who haven't had a chance to dive into the text, I know that the Blues, Woods explores the Blues Sustainable Development Complex, as he terms it, which is sort of has 3 components. One, sort of interlocking relationships between nature, family, community, and ontology. 2, sort of a dedication of parents to pass local knowledge and traditions, including norms, to children, and also kind of beyond what we understand to be nuclear family structure, since that was sort of impossible if you were persisting and staying alive under a regime of chattel slavery. And then sort of neighborhood, like Jason, you just mentioned, like mutual aid, sort of social organizations, including ones for fun and pleasure and recreation, that still provide, as he says, like healthcare, sort of forms of pension, funeral benefits, and then support for Black businesses. So all of these being components of an orientation that isn't even necessarily like a essentialized, like cultural, I don't know, phenomenon, but the response and tactics that are developed because of really intense forms of violence and regimes of control placed on a group of people. And so that happens here in New Orleans, but it can happen in parts of West Africa, it could happen in parts of South America and beyond. I want to ask a question, if I can, to all of y'all, which is, does this, or how does this book sort of shift how you think about your disaster work, your scholarship and practice? Like, why should a disaster person be interested in a text like this?
Can I start? I was actually thinking about this a lot, because I was wondering, as I was particularly, I guess, in the latter chapters, I was thinking a lot about the editorial team's perhaps understanding of disasters in a way that we understand it, from sort of learn about hazards, I guess, right, more, and then hopefully come into social construct, and then all the paradigms that we're doing now. And it's, to me, that blues philosophy that you've just talked about is just such a fantastic framing, because that tripartite, those three elements, right, the kind of tripartite framework, explains exactly, I think, what we are trying to explain very often in the creation and also resistance of disaster risk creation. Because after all, it is all about resisting the system, right, and kind of challenging the status quo. And that's kind of the third element, right, of the blues philosophy that you've just described, that kind of ethical development agenda, right, that opposes slavery, that opposes monopoly and racism, but also the importance of capacities, for choice of a better word, right? I'll use a very disastery kind of scholarship word, in that you need to have hope, right? And you need to be part of the community and kind of be in solidarity with that community, because on your own you don't do that. And I think we very often, when we we use disaster speak, right, those kind of vulnerabilities and capacities, that disaster speak loses human element. It loses emotion, because it immediately labels people, right? You're capable, or you're vulnerable, or like you're resilient and you're vulnerable. Whereas blues philosophy introduces a human, right, and a community within that human. And so to me, that is just such a useful framing. And then how that framework is kind of narrated by people to people, instead of, by people via researchers who then actually narrate what they want to narrate. And another thing that is, I'm kind of going to throw back the question at you, but perhaps after others respond, is the way that Woods talks about class. And I'm going to read just one line here, and this is from chapter 6, where he writes: "The working class was engaged in the preservation and expansion of the cultural, social, and economic institutions that were the pillars of survival, resistance, mobility, and creativity." And it's on page 187. And so he keeps coming back to kind of to working class. And I think in disaster scholarship, we don't really talk about class. It's perhaps the most uncomfortable conversation in the context of disasters. We talk about disability, we talk about women and children, we talk about anything but class. So why is that? And why don't we, and how should we?
Class and capitalism, things we don't talk about. Well, we talk about.
But that's all we talk about, I think.
Most people don't.
I don't know what you're talking about. Like, disaster people talk about low income populations all the time.
So
that's such a great question. But go ahead, Jason.
No. If you want to respond to the question, I was going to tell you how this was affecting how I think.
I think you need to share. I need to marinate on this question a little bit more. Yeah. I don't know.
Sorry.
Well, I think it's in that same vein. I really appreciated the way that the attention kept coming back to sometimes very complex political dynamics, and like a lot of it was very, very much rooted in what was going on in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the US at certain points of time. Different alliances that were being made, and like what the social ramifications of political goings on were. And I think underlying that was, we were talking about vulnerabilities. We're talking about inequalities and injustices that were being manufactured. And I love the way that he was like so intentional about naming that and saying, I think like the word like manufacturing this and manufacturing that, including things like poverty, like homelessness, and like being very intentional about saying this is a decision that for this to be imposed on people. a lot of that ties into like the kind of pushback against different social progress that's being made at different points in time in the United States, and how bourbonism was so in tune with that, or allied with those pushbacks, and even driving those pushbacks. But to me, it comes back to like how that impacts my thinking about disasters relates to the injustice and inequality that is underlying what we call social vulnerability. And sometimes we can, or our field can distance itself from the political intent to create these vulnerabilities that we might just call social, like you said, low income communities. We study them all the time, right? But the political intention to create those disparate geographies of what we would call risk, I think is really central. So to me, it's about like, how do we locate people who are resisting the creation of vulnerability, or resisting the imposition of vulnerability on them, resisting being labeled as vulnerable, because as we see from the book, that the mentality coming out of Reaganism, starve the beast, which was the intentional creation of vulnerability in order to like further enclose territories, further penalize those who then were left without, and then blame them for being in the conditions that they were. And so, yeah, I think, and another thing that comes to mind is like, how do we map vulnerability? How do we measure vulnerability? And there's a lot of parallels to Chocolate Cities that you recommended to me, Darian. McKittrick's work for sure on Black geographies. Like in the last year, my mind has just been blown by the scholarship underpinning a different way of looking at geography in the United States. So I'm just really grateful for getting into this kind of reading, because it just changes the way I look at the place I now live, for sure.
Yeah, answering old Darian's question about how this impacted my work. Obviously, my work is not directly related to disasters, but somehow I see that it is. So I just happened to be getting a paper ready about my field work in Guinea-Bissau. So I look at how these communities actually decide to migrate or stay put given their present circumstances and environmental degradation or climate change. So before the hazard is even there are a couple of events that have happened throughout history that have put people in that position. So I'm trying to demonstrate that the decisions that people actually take in terms of migration, it's very much influenced by a state that is not present in their lives. So I talk about state absenteeism. In that matter, Jason was very helpful when he posted recently on Twitter, how did we frame vulnerability? And I started thinking about this. Okay, yes, these people don't have the state, so how do they get by? So they really rely on themselves, on their self-reliance, on their mutual aid within the community, and this is how people live day by day. So when we talk about a hazard that it's a future possibility, that's so distant from their imaginaries, because they are worried about their present circumstances. And when Clyde Woods spoke about the eviction, and when the people had to leave during the Katrina and never came back to New Orleans, and were placed in trailers, can't remember where, somewhere, but were not entitled to that right to the city anymore, if they ever were before. It just made me think, even if these people get relocated, relocation is not always a good thing. You might run away from a place because of the hazard about your circumstances, but it doesn't mean that relocation is actually something positive for you. And the example that Clyde Woods gives during the Katrina, it puts things into perspective for me, especially when he also talks about, I was shocked to hear that there were almost no non-governmental organizations before Katrina, and all of a sudden they came to help. And it's just like in Africa, all the resources go for administration. 86% of the resources in most organizations just go to pay foreign consultants, and none of the issues locally gets to be addressed. So yeah, it was really useful. A lot of the language that he uses as well, I kind of saw what was going to be useful to me and how I could use this in my work. So yeah, very important.
And I think on the note of cadres of professionals that kind of come in to do work after, a moment, after an event. To answer your question, Ksenia, about why maybe disaster folks don't talk about class, it's messy and hard, and inevitably will lead to like confronting at the local level, confronting really difficult histories. So I know, I think about Alice O'Connor's work a lot. When she writes about poverty knowledge and how poverty goes from this whole constellation of, not just income and wealth, but access to political power, local history, all the institutions, that pulls in a lot of folks engaged in the democratic struggle to deal with this issue, becomes sort of abstracted into a set of variables. And through that process, only sort of like a select few people are trained in a practical way to sort of intervene or to even sort of conceive of the problem and set the terms of engagement. In disasters specifically, I think a lot about working in small towns and in rural locales in the United States following a major disaster declaration, where folks are familiar with this, especially on the practice side. Like, you have to, like, even if you just kind of pull up a map of the parcels of land and like look at who owns what land, especially in the South, you'll find that one or two, maybe three families kind of own everything. And coincidentally, that family name is over like the nearest plantation, or like they were sort of confirmed like a major slaveholding family. And as a result, a lot of the resources that go towards sort of dealing with a disaster, long after the end of chattel slavery, while other forms of state-taken slavery persist in the United States, those resources have to touch that family in some way, shape, or form, or they're part of this process of negotiating even like what recovery looks like. And that manifests even in town meetings where people talk about what they want, how to rebuild, if something should be rebuilt or not. And when you talk about class, rather than just like low income, high income, you have to, confront who's owned that land, who's plundered it, who has owned other people's families who still live in that town, and then like the differences in political power that they have to just shape what the built environment looks like. And I know for me, just in my couple years of doing that work, it was really intense and came up repeatedly. So that's a really long answer to your question. But
no, this is, I absolutely love this, because as we kind of, as we talk about class, and I mean, this probably sounds quite mean, but I wonder whether we do not want to unpack the issue of class, because we all know that if we look at it historically, working classes where solidarity and resistance lie, right? This is where the foundation kind of solidarity and resistance is. And maybe perhaps if we start engaging and kind of really thinking about working class, we might accidentally solve the problem of disaster risk creation, right? Because we would accidentally encourage resistance and solidarity, and we definitely don't want that, because how would capitalism survive then? And I'm kind of quite flippant about it, but there is something, to me, this is, when you're talking about the your engagements, right, that then kind of never make it onto the sort of main stage, if you wish, right, of disaster scholarship, or even very often kind of scholarship at all. And we're not even talking about policy and practice. It's quite a convenient cover. And I think we've been talking about this a lot in our academic practice, how even the most theoretically rigorous academics, right, and theoretically rigorous journals refuse to engage with the issue of class, and kind of refuse to even consider that narrative or allow for that narrative to happen. And a great example, again going back to New Orleans, is the comment that Wes and I got, saying, but look, New Orleans is resilient now, all the Black population has been removed. That's great, isn't it? We wanted resilience, here it is. How do you respond to that? Without cursing.
Without cursing, yeah. One part of in chapter 6, I really like the part about the Panthers. So I was reading Huey Newton's Revolutionary Suicide last week, and it gave me, I was really happy to see that Clyde Woods was looking at this briefly. I would have loved to hear more actually about the history in New Orleans. But one thing that stood out to me, well, was, and I picked it up from Huey Newton's book, an account, very personal account of the origins of the Panthers, was just how it was also centered in this blues tradition too, and the leadership coming from Louisiana, and then like how that solidarity, how the community caring for each other was actually such a threat to the intentional dependencies that were being created, dependencies that were allowing all sorts of exploitation, and still do allow exploitation. And so one of the bits was in chapter 6. He was talking about J. Edgar Hoover saying that it was the free children's breakfast program that was the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. Free grits, and the subtitle of that, or the subheading, was the Black Panther Party and the assassination of free grits, which is a funny title, but a very serious problem when community caring for each other is the biggest internal threat to your country. That's heavy, right?
yeah, I think again, in kind of a self-serving way, like this book is for me the reminder of why I became interested in disaster, because it's just a space in terms of scholarship, practice, just as a human being, to sort of more easily be explicit about some of the struggles that we're kind of engaged in, some of the existential struggles for some of us, regarding genocide, regarding capitalism, both of these in their role in climate change. But also, this book is sort of my gateway out of disaster studies. And like my actual dissertation, because I am in a PhD program, which I forget sometimes, isn't explicitly about disaster. It is involving the role of organized Black Muslim communities, from the Nation of Islam to Black Sunni mosques to a variety of sort of smaller groupings, who were the first Muslims in the United States, and have a lineage from the slave trade, the first, and the lineage of resistance, of preserving Islam, of preserving forms of the Arabic language, came up through the South and came up north from the Great Migration. And the central question of my dissertation, which is how are the forms of resistance, social services, and actual sort of urban design interventions that these Black Muslims have implemented in the North, how are they in and of themselves forms of planning that are not really legible to the field of urban planning? And in what ways can this be, like Clyde Woods's Blues Sustainable Development Complex, sort of be traced to this larger lineage of the Black radical tradition, and the way he pulls in the Panthers and the way he pulls in SNCC. And so how is that connected to, these other questions about risk creation, about the resilience of institutions, about capacity? And so that's kind of what I spend most of my time doing, actually, right now. And I'm really grateful to Woods and to Jordan T. Camp and Laura Polito for sort of pulling these ideas together for me as a student. Yeah, there's no question there. I'm sorry.
Just a comment. I mean, for perfect academic, Darren. No, but this is great, And I chuckled when you said I don't always do disasters. I kind of, the more I get, I think, into disaster scholarship, it's just everything is about disasters, isn't it? Because we live in just one big disaster. It's sort of regardless of what you study, be that microbiology or urban design, we sort of end up with disasters. And I want to sort of, I guess my final reflection maybe here, and to build on your comment again, comment rather than a question, is that we're really good at those. Is that the idea of naturalness, right? And I think again the discussion is not necessarily about disasters, but what I started thinking about, and of course, in the book, the natural disasters, right? I kind of unpacked, is the connection between the natural attributes of Black people, right? And he writes early on, I think it is chapter 2, the sort of natural products of laziness, ignorance, and immorality, right? And the blame that comes with that. And then the narratives that we see in disaster studies about natural disasters, right? And the blame on nature, and everything. So we are basically, what I'm trying to say is that we are prepared to blame absolutely everything and anything apart from the power of political decision making. And isn't it convenient? And doesn't it work for absolutely everything when we talk about disaster risk creation?
Yeah,
Jason kind of raised his eyebrows. Sorry, Claudia.
Yeah, I was going to say, and it's interesting that the return of the Bourbonism always happens during moments of crisis, which they themselves create, right? So the moments of crisis that are described in this book, I mean, being them the Great Flood of 1927, the Hurricane Betsy, and then Katrina. So all the preconditions people lived in were actually created by this elite, but it's then in those moments of crisis that they thrive. I mean, for me, this is quite appalling. Even maybe I haven't thought about this in this depth before. Yeah, yeah. I'm just gonna leave one question without wanting to remove Ksenia's comment from the conversation. Do you feel like a third reconstruction is really underway, has been underway since Katrina? I know he kind of mentions how the Black Lives Matter movement has picked from that, but I'm curious to know, as an American citizen, whether you see this happening. Do you think that Katrina was really a new moment forward, or can you preview another crisis being how do you say, like, I'm not sure if the word precipitated is the most appropriate here, by the elites once again?
Well, I can try to respond. I mean, I think that when this book was written, there was definitely, definitely things happening and changes in the wind that inspired that kind of hope. And I think a lot of people switched off. 8 years of Obama, a lot of people felt that things were suddenly better. But I mean, if you look at this deep history, it's clear that in those periods where some concessions are being made to maybe improve the lives of some people, the underbelly is just kind of trying its best to co-opt and to make those who want change to compromise. And I think that's one of the things that kind of sticks with me in this, is just in all those moments of hope and moments where resistance seemed to be breaking through. There was intense, like, fear on behalf of the establishment, and kind of working double time to co-opt whoever could be co-opted to make sure that the resistance was quashed. And I think coming to the after Katrina, when there was such deep feeling of injustice, and kind of obvious to everybody that something needed to change, I think that was kind of derailed by the Obama years, in my opinion. And yeah, like, one of the things that disturbs me living here now, I hadn't lived here in the United States as an adult until I moved to Florida a couple of years ago. But one of the things that disturbs me is just that people are resigned. Not everybody, a lot of people are just resigned to, hoping that the next election is going to fix things. And I think that we know that that's not going to work out well if you're putting all your hope in the U.S. electoral process.
Yeah, I think touching on things that all of you shared, Ksenia, with this sort of interrogating naturalness, Claudia, with your references to some of the histories explored in the book, of these moments in time that sort of make more concrete and reify, like, power structures that were kind of existing and responsible for a lot of violence, and this question about the future and the viability of the American electoral political system. I'm thinking about how Woods, one, articulates the idea of planned abandonment. I'm really grateful that I had this book before the pandemic, because for me, it gave me sort of vocabulary and a framework to understand what we were about to experience entering the pandemic, in terms of just on a social cultural level for some people and on an explicit political level, just being okay with massive amounts of death, and being okay with massive amounts of death that are not only preventable, but completely predictable and kind of follow along very unsurprising groups of people. And I know Woods interrogates planned crisis, which he says, in which like the sustainable political economic alternatives are made to appear irrational, while the descent into peonage and chaos to bourbonism is made to seem rational and even patriotic. I think that kind of characterizes many of our experiences with a variety of disasters, including this moment that we're in, and this sort of unfolding process that we're in. I know Woods references like very difficult events, like Claudia, like you mentioned, the Great Flood of 1927, where leadership dynamited certain levees in order to prevent other areas of town from flooding, and that led to a lot of devastation and death. And your question about whether we're in like a third Reconstruction, like that's so difficult. I know when Woods talks about these different slaveries, like first slavery being kind of OG slavery, native genocide, let's use black bodies to build the foundations of whatever. The second one being sort of the expansion of the plantation economy, and the third one being kind of formed after the Civil War in response to it. It still kind of feels like we're in the third slavery. So maybe we're in a moment where, yeah, those terms are still relevant. But I think the way Woods talks about sort of planned abandonment and planned crisis implicates all of us who work in this world, and sort of challenges us to make, like he says, the sustainable political economic alternatives, make those more viable, because we don't have choice if we want to avoid kind of continued mass death.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you, Darren. This was a really powerful conclusion, very powerful summary, and a really powerful book. So, for those who joined us later, we've been reading Development Drowned and Reborn by Clyde Woods. If you haven't read it, please read it. Engage with this text. It's fantastic. And thank you, Darren, again for choosing this for us. I'm sure we could be talking for another couple of hours, but our time is up today. And just a couple of announcements. So first of all, we don't know what the next book is. So, for people watching out there, we've been spectacularly disorganized, but we will choose next book. We will choose a person who is choosing next book.
It's you, Ksenia.
Is it me again? Okay, I'll... do not encourage me. See, Claudia is keeping track. But we will announce the book. I'll have a think about this. As you know, Jason and I are taking a little break between the seasons, but this Friday we are releasing Friday special. So if you've missed us, or if you didn't, do listen to it. It's a fantastic episode. And of course, there is a Christmas special coming up just before Christmas, full of quizzes and jokes. And I don't know what else. We haven't organized that yet either. And the new season is starting in January, early January. And the whole season 6 is dedicated to the early career researchers. So please join us then. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Darren, again. And thank you, Claudia, for your time and for reading the book.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.
Thanks, y'all.